the Sony has up to 120 frames per second, but only in 1080. And the M50 also has 120 frames per second, but only in 720. You know what it is? You really can't judge a camera by a spec sheet alone, and the specs can often be not only confusing, but also misleading. So what we're gonna do today, I'm gonna break down for you the differences between these cameras that actually matter. Let me start off by saying both of these cameras are amazing cameras, that's for sure, especially when you consider the price point. And being that they're both similar in price, you would think that it would be difficult to decide if you should get the Canon M50 or the Sony ZVE10. But in actuality, the choice is obvious. And the reason being is that there are certain key differences between these cameras that are going to completely exclude one or the other for you, depending on how you plan on using it. Let me show you what I mean. All right, where's that Canon M50 at?
I say, hold up, wait a minute. I say,
there it is. So 99% of what I do is video. So I'm using the flip out screen pretty much the whole time. But I've noticed that the majority of photographers prefer what's called the electronic viewfinder, the EVF. And that's a little thing that you look through when you're framing up your shot. For me, that's not really important as I hardly use it. But if you're doing a lot of photography, then obviously you're not going to go for the ZVE10 because all it has is the flip out screen and it doesn't have an EVF. Now, on the other hand, let's say you don't really do any photography and you're mostly a video shooter like me. Then in that case, it might or might not be a big deal for you that the Canon M50 limits you to a 30-minute record time. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not able to make videos that are longer than 30 minutes. What it means is that once you hit record, when 30 minutes is up, it's gonna stop recording and you have to actually hit the record button again. Whereas the Sony doesn't have any record time limit. Now for the type of content that I produce, most of my clips are only a few minutes long and then I piece them together when I go to edit the footage. But let's imagine that my main work was filming sports events that are gonna last longer than 30 minutes and I don't want any break in the footage as I might miss some of the action. Then in that case, for sure, I wouldn't go with the Canon M50 or M50 Mark II, and I would go with the ZVE10 instead. Now, let's say you're a solo content creator like me. Then this next thing is going to be a big point for the M50. And what that is that you could basically use the touch screen to change all your settings. So let's say you're filming and you're in front of the camera and you got the flippy screen flipped out, and all of a sudden you realize you need to change your ISO. You can change your ISO without having to walk over there behind the camera or having to use the knobs on the camera. You just touch the screen and pretty much all the settings that you need to change, you can do so with the touch screen. The Sony is going to force you to use the knobs. Now the problem with that is that if you got your shot framed up perfectly, even the smallest amount of change in the framing is going to be obvious when you go to piece the video together. And when you go to change your settings by having to use the buttons or the knobs, inevitably the camera is going to move, even if it's just a little bit. But that little bit is going to be obvious once you come to put the video together. So that's a pretty big deal. And while we're on that topic, having to navigate through the Sony menus is horrible. Sony is notorious for having some of the most unusable, confusing, and clunky menu systems. Now they upgraded on the A7S III and some of their newer cameras, but the ZVE10 unfortunately is using the old menu system. Now on the other hand, Canon is famous for having some of the most easy to use cameras and some of the most simple to navigate menus. And if you're a beginner, which I'm assuming many of you will be because these are entry-level cameras, you don't want to have to worry about menus and the camera getting in your way. You want everything to be as easy to use as possible because you still have to learn how to use the camera. You have to learn about all your manual settings such as ISO, aperture, frame rate, white balance, and everything else. In terms of ease of use, think of Canon cameras like Apple and think of Sony like Windows or Linux or something like that. Man, Windows is so unstable. And speaking about stability, that reminds me, the ZVE10 and the M50 both have electronic image stability. But the difference is that the ZVE10 crops in about 45%, while the M50 only crops in about 10%. Now, Sony does have something called catalyst browse, which allows you to use the gyro data from the camera so that you can stabilize your footage in post. But the problem with that is to get catalyst browse to work right, you're supposed to crank up your shutter speeds to some ridiculously high amount that's going to have your footage looking a little bit weird. On top of that, it takes longer as it's an extra step you're going to have to do in post. So for image stability, I got to give the point to the Canon, as the digital image stabilization on the M50 and M50 Mark II is actually quite good. Now, if you take a look at all the videos I have in my YouTube channel, you're going to notice that you can watch them all in 4K. But here's the thing, all of them were recorded in 1080. So what I do is I record the footage in 1080, and then after I edit it, I just export it in 4K. And the reason I do that is because the difference in quality between doing it that way versus actually recording in 4K is marginal. While at the same time, the file sizes in 4K versus 1080 are ridiculous. And it's gonna eat up your SD card space, it's gonna eat up your hard drive space. And on top of that, when you go to edit the footage, unless you got a super duper efficient computer, 4K is gonna be a lot harder to edit for your machine, and it's gonna take a lot longer. So speaking of 4K footage, if you are gonna be shooting in 4K, then you need to know the 4K coming out of the Canon M50 is almost unusable because you lose dual pixel autofocus and it has an extreme crop. And this leads me to my next point, autofocus. If you're a solo content creator, autofocus is crucial. And thank God, both of these cameras have amazing autofocus. Both Canon and Sony have the best autofocus in the game, hands down. Now, the Sony keeps its amazing autofocus whether you shoot in 1080 or in 4K. So the point goes to Sony on that one. But again, if you're a 1080 shooter like me, the M50 has better look in 1080 and it has autofocus in 1080, whereas with the Sony, 1080 doesn't look as good. And another very important subject for video shooters is your frame rate options. And to make it simple for you to understand, you mainly use high frame rate options for filming slow motion. So if your camera allows you to have 60 frames per second, then you can get pretty good slow motion. And if your camera allows you to have 120 frames per second, then you can get super duper slow motion. The Canon M50 allows you to do 60 frames per second in 1080, whereas the ZVE10 allows you to do 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second in 1080, which is gonna give you the ability to do slower slow motion than the M50 can. Now you would think that the point will go to the Sony for that one because it has the 120 and 1080p. But the thing is, that the Sony's 1080p doesn't look as good as the Canon M50s. So it's kind of a tough one in that regard. So let me summarize all this by giving you my biased opinion as a Canon user. If you ask me, the Canon M50 is still the best beginner camera out there. When you start to tally it all up, those beautiful Canon colors, the ease of use with the ability to navigate through all your settings just by touching the screen, and not to mention the M50 is just a little bit cheaper than the Sony ZVE10. Although it's not by much, but it's still enough to where you can get an extra lens or something like that with that little bit of money that you're gonna save. Now the difference between the Canon M50 and the M50 Mark II is marginal. It's a very small price difference, and the only advantage that the Mark II has over the original M50 is that it's easier to live stream with. And I would say, if you're inclined towards the Canon and what's holding you back is the fact that it doesn't have autofocus in 4K, it has an extreme crop, and it doesn't offer 120 frames per second, then in that case, you may want to seriously consider the Canon M6 Mark II, because that's another kind of entry-level camera which has all those features. Now let me tell you, whichever one of these cameras you get, if you just slap the kit lens on there and you put everything in auto mode and you just hit record and treat it like a point and shoot, in that case, the footage that you're going to get out of your cell phone, depending on which cell phone you have, may look better than the footage you're going to get out of these cameras, because cell phones have come up a lot and the auto mode on those cell phones is quite nice. But if you're willing to learn how to use these cameras in manual mode, where you have control over your ISO, your shutter speed, your frame rate, your white balance, etc., and you have a few good lenses, then the footage you're going to be able to get out of these cameras far surpasses anything you're going to be able to get out of any mobile phone. And I know as a beginner, it might seem difficult to have to learn and deal with all those things. But to make it easy for you, I made a whole bunch of tutorial videos about how to get cinematic footage out of your camera as a beginner that goes over the settings you need, lenses, etc. And you'll see that thumbnail at the end of this video. So make sure you click on that thumbnail if that's stuff that you need to brush up on. So I hope that helps, guys. Is that my mama calling? I gotta go. Peace.